All right, let's look at weight painting and the different options you have when you start to weight paint. So the first thing we're going to do is put some joints in. And I'm going to turn on grid here and put it in the front view. And it's going to hit this grid here. Let's see, it'll hit that there. I'll put this one up here. That's just so it stays perfectly in a chain. And then I'm going to grab my geometry. I'll start a layer based on this. Geometry layer, that'll just let me turn it off and on easily. I'll grab my joint chain. We'll drop this down so we can see all of them. With just one selected, it'll put the entire chain in there. And I'll name this joint layer. And I'm going to take my geo layer and turn it into a template. I'm going to grab this bottom. I'll turn the grid off and I'll bring this one joint up. I'll hold D, bring it kind of into the middle, right about there. I'll bring this one down a bit. Okay. So let's just bind this real quick and go through some of the options. So I'm going to select my joint and then my cylinder, and I'll come up to skin. I'll bring up the options. When you're binding things, it's a good idea to, instead of just going with the default, try to get the best bind out of, like, especially if you're doing an organic character. You can get really good results right out of the box if you mess with some of these settings. So we'll just start. This is the one that is kind of the default. So I'm going to hit apply, and then if we grab our cylinder, I'll template my joint layer so I can't grab them. I'm going to grab my geometry. I'll right click on it, come up to paint skin weights tool. You can also double click on this, and this option is going to come up. So this is what's happened with that. Anywhere in the white area, that means this joint is going to have full control over it and completely deform it. Anywhere where it's in the dark area, it's not. So if I grab, this joint right here, it's gonna kind of have a fall off down there, and up here at the top, right, it's gonna have some there. So what we want is really none of this. Since this top is just a guiding point for this, we don't want this to have any white up here. Likewise, this drop off right here is a lot, so that means these vertex points are going to be influenced when I bend this down. So let's just close this bind skin options and see what happens when we start to mess with these joints. So come back, turn off template. And so now when I grab this joint here and let's say I just bend it down, you can see if this was supposed to be an arm, we're getting a really, it's not a crisp bend at all. Now this might be what you want for some things, but if this was an organic character, this would be very rubbery, and we can do better with that right out of the box. But just to show you kind of the weight painting, what it can do, or how you approach it, we're going to grab our geometry before we go back, and we're going to rebind it. But I just want to go over some of these options. So we'll go back to Paint Skin Weights tool, and so the first thing that you want to look at is this little panel up here. It's kind of one thing that's annoying about Maya is navigating this, is weight painting generally, but then navigating this little this little part right here, because sometimes you want to go in and deform something to see if it's okay. So if you come back to grab that, then your weights disappear, and then you might, so it's this constant battle of going back and forth. I wish they would have something to where we could see, the view of the weight painting, like easy access to that. One thing people do is like, keyframe. So they'll maybe keyframe here, and then they'll, before it's rigged, you can go to bind pose, and wherever the joints were when you bound it, they'll reset to that. So that's all I did for that when we back to. So now we can see this. So when we come back to our joints over here. That's another thing. You have to make sure that the geometry is selected, not the joints. So we can see this kind of in action, right? So then I'll come to this, and I can see that fall off is a lot. So let's look at some options that we could use right out of the gate. One of them is going to be, you can select, well, we'll go over the first one. The most obvious one is paint. And if I leave it on interactive right here, it'll allow me to come in here and paint. Let me hold down B and make this brush size smaller. And so what we want to do is, on some of these joints, I can go in and paint a different value. So I'll come up here and make sure it's on replace or add. So replace is going to take this value here and just whatever is here, replace it. So if it's at 0, everything I paint right here is going to turn dark. All right? So it's just overriding any of those values. You go in and paint all this. Okay, so that's going to be one way. I'm going to undo that. The thing is, in interactive, which you should be using, you should not be using normalization off. You should not be using post. Off is going to mean that you want these values of these vertexes between 0 and 1. 0 is going to be completely black, white. 1 is going to be completely white. If you have normalized weights on interactive, it's going to ensure that when you're painting on this, it's going to always equal 1. If you take it off, you can get values over 1, and then it can lead to craziness down the line. If you leave it on post, you might be able to go over 1 in some areas, but if this vertex is shared by three different joints, it's going to get divided between the 3 different ones after the fact. So if you go up to 2, it'll be divided by these 3 to equal 100% or to equal 1. Again, that can lead to all kinds of problems, especially on export. So you just want to keep it at interactive, and that's going to ensure that the weights stay between 0 and 1. Now the catch is, if I come in here and I paint this away, when I come to my different joint up here, when I come to my first joint or my second joint, you can see it's now modified, right? It's made this gray, it's made this completely white in areas. So it's got to equalize itself. So if I come over here and paint this, start to paint this black, and I come back to this, you can see it's now made that even more white. So just take note of that. It's got to equal itself at 1. So it's going to do, usually the joint closest to it is what it's going to be re-adding to or taking away from to equalize that 1. That's not always the case. Sometimes you might have a weird, on an arm, like a thumb connected to the rib cage or something. So you got to kind of be careful of that. But that's kind of the basic idea. Is in interactive, it's got to equal 1. So when we take away things here, right, and we go to this next joint, you can see it's being added to that. So be mindful of that. This other one, add, it's going to add whatever value you have here. So if I come up to 0.2, it's going to keep adding to that. If I paint it again, that's going to be around 0.5. If I go back again, that'll be around 75. So it'll keep adding to that. Now it's still doing the same thing, right? So it's still equalizing. Sometimes when you turn it on interactive, there seems to be a bug in Maya, especially in 2020, that either the display does not update, so you're painting in weights, but it'll keep this preview. So that can be problematic. If that happens, try to just switch back between off and interactive. Sometimes it actually it does the opposite. You're painting in, but it's not listening to it's not inputting that correct panel. Either way, both of those things work if you turn it off and then turn it back on. All right, so another thing you can do is this smooth. So smooth, you can work with the brush. You can also hit this flood down here. So let's say I want to go in and replace at 0 values all of this area here. Right? And I got like a sharp, it's just too sharp. So when it comes here, it's just too sharp. Remember we keyframed that earlier so we can see what's going on. If I come to smooth, I could go in and paint that in, but sometimes you want just, right, you want just the blanket value of this entire joint to be affected. So if I hit flood, it's going to smooth all of these vertex. So if there's like 1 here and 0 here at this next vertex, it's going to divide between the two and make this one like 0.25, make this one 0.75, or whatever value you give it. So you can see it smoothing itself out there. And again, as it smooths, that means that this next one is going to be the opposite of that. Okay, so the next thing we can look at is select. So if I come to these vertexes right here, I don't really, it sometimes gets annoying to try to go in and paint these when I know I want this ring of vertexes right here, of vertices that I want to change. So I can come into this select here, and then it's going to go to this vertex mode, and I'll come up to, select geometry. Right. And then I can, with select added, I'm going to shift and I can loop select this, and then grab that middle one, and then I can flood this as well. I can come back to paint with those selected. I could paint these out, or I can just come in, since they are selected, Maya knows I want to assign a value to this to 1 if I flood it. So then I have this little bit right here. So let's see, joint 3, yep, still got a little bit there. So I'll come back to select. I'll grab this, hold shift, double click this next one to where it makes a ring selection, and I'll flood this at 1. Let me go back to paint and I'll flood that. And then let's just make sure, this last one, flood that. And now I have joint 3, it's still making. So I'm going to come in here knowing that I don't want joint 3 to have anything. I'm going to select the whole geometry and paint it all at a value of 0. So that gets rid of that influence. So now I just have the influence between these two, and so that's 2 ways you can approach it. You can paint it in, or you can go individually into these vertices 1 by 1, come back to paint, and then flood it. Or you can still paint these vertices as is. So if this is at 0 with replace, I could come in and start painting this if I wanted to. So those are ways that you can do skin painting. It's a little clunky. I don't really like the UI, and I don't like the way it switches back. I just feel like it needs a major overhaul, but that's kind of the main things to use is select or directly paint, or select the entire geometry to do flood, or in paint mode actually use the brush to paint and then use replace to override values, add to incrementally add to areas, or smooth to smooth out things between 2 areas. So let's come back to this. There's 2 other things that we can look at really quickly that are kind of useful, I think. So I'll come up to paint skin weights just so we can see what we're looking at. And one good way to get rid of, instead of going in and painting all this out, a good tool that I use very often is this prune small weights. And if I bring this little option up here, it's going to say prune below. So if I leave this at 50, 0.5 is going to be a gray area. So anything below 0.5 is going to turn black. So if I hit apply right here, you can see that it's going to turn all this kind of black. Now this wasn't, you can see also the binding mode over here and over here might not be the best. So let me bring that up a little bit more to 0.53. Okay, so those are at just completely 1 now. So let me go back. Maybe I don't want that much. Let's say 0.25. And then it should take off less. So I'll hit apply. You can see anything with 0.25. So this is really helpful for, let me go back up to like 0.5. So let's say I want to get rid of some of this. I can go to 0.5. It'll get rid of it. And then if I want to, I can use this in conjunction with smooth and smooth some of it. Let's, you know, smooth this a little bit to maybe 0.25 of opacity. So you can see it's just barely doing it, so I can hit this a couple times and it'll start to smooth it out. And it's still a little bit different. So these are things that I feel like are useful tools, is pruning, and then using that in conjunction with re-smoothing it. Maybe you want a little bit more precise smooth, so pruning is a good kind of tool. Another thing we can look at is, the last thing is the component editor. So I'm going to come in here and grab these vertices, and this isn't necessarily, you don't have to, it works, you can drop from the component editor your skin weights, but it's not gonna, you don't necessarily need the paint tool, the paint skin weight tool open. So with these vertexes selected, I can go up to Windows, General Editors, Component Editor, and this will have all of your components and your nodes that you've hooked up. So if I come all the way over here, you can see our smooth skin. That's going to be our skin cluster. If I select this, it's going to bring up all of the joints that are associated with it, with these vertices that I've selected. And let's say, because I know I want them only being affected by this, and I don't want these affected by this second joint, I can come in here and say, oh, second joint, these are all the vertices I've selected. And now I can say I don't want these affected by joints 2 or 3 at the top. So I'll come down, select all these. With all of them selected, I can hit 0. You can see some of the values are extremely small, 0.055, and these things might escape you. So I'll press 0. And that'll mean that this is not going to be affected by this joint now. So if we come in and grab this joint here, and we move it, you can see it's the ones we just zeroed out are not being affected by this. So this component editor is also a good tool, so you can see, you might think you have something completely, you know, you might think your, like say this row here is completely at 1, but you might scroll through it and you might find a hidden value. Maybe it's just off slightly, or maybe this bottom point down here, right? Maybe it was getting affected by, you know, a different joint. Like this one right here is getting affected by this joint 3 by 0.004. You know, so you might go in and have to adjust that way. And you can see here's the normalization, right? Since I took that off, it's now, it had to even this out, and 0.006 equals 0.994. So that's that interactive normalization kind of working. All right, so that's a quick overview of using the component editor to adjust your smooth skins, and then looking at this tool up here, what exactly is interactive skin weighting, what is the flood, what is selecting individual vertices to use to paint with or to flood with, and then what is replace, what is add, and what is smooth. So this should give you a good overview of what exactly weight painting is and what these tools are.